could you apply the same approach to do some storytelling on this corporate strategy? And I said yes. Then they told me that gave me the buzzwords, and I said, what is that? So the answer is yes, I will find a way.
In this episode, you'll get to know Simeon Quarrie, the transformative storyteller, and you'll hear the story of how he turned his passion for both technology and the arts into a multimedia business that serves some of the world's biggest brands. I'm Dave Crenshaw, and this is My Success Show. Welcome back, friends, to the Dave Crenshaw Success Show. This is where I speak to some of the most successful people I've met in my life's journey. I'm on a mission to find universal principles of success that you can apply immediately and that my family can apply immediately. If you're not familiar with me, I'm a best-selling author. I speak around the world to Fortune 500 companies, and I've taught millions of people how to be successful through my online courses, especially in my courses on LinkedIn Learning. With this show, I wanted to do something different. I was thinking about how could I create a legacy that would help my children succeed. And I thought, wow, I know all these amazing people. Let me find some principles that I can teach them, and that will help them succeed in their life. But then I thought, well, why not share the experience with you as I do that? And my goal is to interview people who have multifaceted success. So not just career or financial success, even though those are very important, but that they also have balanced lives and have fun and spend time with the people that they care about. And I'm looking for things that you can do right now, not a year from now, not way off into the future, but today, this week, so that you can make my guest's success story a part of your success story. So as I'm interviewing today's guest, look for something you can do. And the person I'm interviewing today, I've gotten to know him through the last few years. We've done some things together, and I have such a high degree of respect for him and his craft. Simeon Quarrie is the CEO of Vivida and is an award-winning international speaker. Recently, he was awarded the UK Creative Entrepreneur of the Year award, and his contributions to learning, cybersecurity, and inclusion are world-renowned. Simeon has addressed audiences for leading organizations such as Canon, Apple, LinkedIn, HSBC, and Google, where he shares his vision for using storytelling and innovation to make subjects such as cybersecurity accessible and engaging. He dedicates his spare time as a board member of the Ideas Foundation, which helps young people enter the creative industry. Simeon, it's been way too long since we spoke last, my friend. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. A long-time fan of your work and what you do, what you talk about.
Oh, well, thank you. Myself, in the same direction to you, I really love what you've done with video, with storytelling. It's always entertaining. You like to take some risks, which I think is really fantastic. But you just have such a personable presence in everything that I've seen you do. And so I've been really excited to do this interview.
Great to chat with you.
And where are you located today?
Some of the audience will naturally know London. If you drive down to the south of the country by about an hour and a half or so, I'm quite close to Salisbury and Salisbury Cathedral at the moment, and I'm sitting here in the studio. So whilst what you see, and for those of you in the audience that can't see, I'm in a kind of a dark studio environment with lots of kit around me, with a light that just illuminates me by myself, just so that you can concentrate and I can concentrate.
Yeah, it looks very mysterious, but also just, of course, perfectly framed because you're a master of video. So let's just dive right into this interview. And I always ask every guest the same question to start off, which is the question we all got asked when we were young. What do you want to be when you grow up? What did you want to be in your formative years? Let's say your teenage years. What did you think you were going to become in terms of your career?
Do you know, for me, actually, growing up, I think there was a lot of uncertainty about what I was going to become. I wasn't sure, partly because I couldn't quite identify what I was good at, or the things I felt I was good at. I couldn't see a pathway from a work perspective.
Now, when I was doing research, you started a business when you were 16. Is that accurate?
Yeah, you have done your research. How did you dig that up? I love it.
Yeah.
So I think partway through my journey, I realized that the thing I really enjoyed was anything that was kind of creative. So I enjoyed anything to do with graphic design, 3D. I loved the internet. I enjoyed gaming. And so with the first business that I was asked to get involved in, it was as a designer, like a web designer. I mean, it was right back at that point in that kind of 1996, 1997. The internet was just forming. So, of course, getting involved in design, I got to work out where those graphics that could load with low bandwidth dial-up connection, where they could be placed and how they could be positioned. So that was kind of my inroad into work, business, but also starting to understand what I truly, really enjoyed.
And what did you learn during that time? Let me preface this question. I remember a mentor saying to me, the secret to success in entrepreneurship is to make sure that it's your second time. What he was implying by that is you kind of have to have a business that doesn't go so well the first time and learn from it, and that helps you in the future. So I like that you did this so young when you were 16. What did you learn from it that helped you in the future?
It was important to love what you do. I didn't actually do that really for commerce and the money side of things. I think what we wanted was to create something that people saw and had impact. And what I learned was that I just got lost in the process of development and developing an audience. So I learned to dig directly into that. I guess the bit that I learned on the other side of it was to find a way that offered value that people would pay for. When we were doing this as like a business with some of my other peers in the class, along with a business studies teacher, it had a social enterprise type of feel to it, right? Almost a charitable-esque type of feel. So the money making wasn't the main aim. However, naturally, as we started to get involved in, I started to grow up, I needed money and I needed revenue. And it became very apparent that I needed to find a way of linking the two things, the thing I was passionate about, but also my need to sustain myself and eventually sustain others.
So that brings up a great point, Simeon, and this is something I've talked to my kids about, in particular my son, who's got some ADHD, which is the idea of feed the valuable obsession. And I think that's what you're talking about. By valuable obsession, I mean it's something that you're passionate about, you're interested in, but it's also valuable, meaning the market has said there is value behind this and we want to pay for it. It sounds like that's sort of where you started to form the beginning of your career.
Yes, but I have to admit, I didn't think about that so early on. And in some ways, I think that's okay, because the key thing, I think, was starting to understand myself, which was key. I had to learn what was valuable, but to be honest, I learned that over time. And it took me some time to be able to scale that value. So look, at the very beginning, I was doing design work. And of course, that design work is done on a bit of a day rate. And then it scales up and it becomes a project. And it took me quite a while before I realized, wait a minute, actually, I don't need to think about things in terms of projects where I hand over all the IP. I can do it and create something where I own, or the business then owns the IP. And I think that was a real journey in understanding that value proposition.
Did you go to university after secondary school?
I did secondary school. I went to college, and at college I worked to kind of understand computers. I did computer science. And then I didn't go to university. And I didn't go to university because culturally it was not something that was encouraged. I was brought up in a very religious household where college was seen as an environment that was fraught with risk. And so my way of increasing my skill sets and talents at that university age was actually to get involved in educating myself, to self-teach. So a lot of the things that I have now as a skill set and a talent is self-taught.
You mentioned how you were studying computers, and yet what you do is so creative based, it's so art based. So were you starting to marry the two? I did also saw that you were a photographer for a time. Was that taking place while you were studying at that college?
So if I think about my pathway into, I guess, the creative sector, when I was in college, I thought I really wanted to do the highly technical element, which I loved the programming and understanding the databases, etc. And there was one particular piece of coursework, as we call it here in the UK, like a practical examination that taught me a lot about myself. They said, you're going to use Microsoft Excel and you need to use macros to come up with an application. And I turned Excel into the equivalent of Paintbrush. And for many of your viewers, you might remember an application on Windows 3.1 that was like Paintbrush, where you would click and you would be able to draw and paint pictures.
This is old school here.
This is really old school. It's dating me. What I did is, if you visualize this in Microsoft Excel, on the left-hand side, you had cells which were a color palette. And if you clicked on one of those cells, let's say the green cell, the macro meant that any other cell that you would click on in that spreadsheet would change color to green. So I turned Microsoft Excel into Paintbrush and submitted.
Oh, wow.
What that taught me about myself is that I love the technical and I have a technical mind, but my fire is lit by creativity. And so I blended the two. So what you now see is that I was always building up that creative element, but then also I was really quite technical. Whether that meant that I was technically really strong at execution, or whether it was really focusing on my creative sensibilities and that sense of style, sense of might be brand or how you get across a message, it ended up being, for me, myself and my identity ended up being about the intersection between the two.
Which now is so valuable, right? That's a huge part of the world that we live in with YouTube and social media and everything. People wanting to share their brand, people wanting to develop their own career. What a valuable blended skill set for you to have.
Yes, and I think that the intersections between two, ideally three things, is often where that value occurs.
So you started to develop this unique perspective of blending these interests together. What did that do in terms of your first career as you left college? Where were you working?
When I was in college, someone spotted my technical skills and asked me to set up an internet service provider back in, literally I left college, and the day I walked out, I stepped straight into a job where someone trusted me with hundreds of thousands of pounds, what ended up being well over £1 million, to build an internet service provider in the dot-com boom, which ended up being a bust. But it taught me a lot about creating something that attracted people. So we attracted 70,000 people in a very short period of time. I got my 15 minutes of fame. And I learned a lot from doing that. I exited out. When I say exited, no, I didn't exit. I left. And I went back into my bedroom. I was a bit disillusioned with the fact that I'd just been part of this business. We grew quite quickly. I delivered for the organization what they wanted, but I realized that I didn't truly believe in what I was building for them. So I went back into my bedroom and I became a graphic designer for a time.
Interesting. Yeah, that was my question when I heard that story. Did you feel fulfilled? Because there wasn't much of a creative outlet. It was only technical during that time, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Talking to you is like talking to a therapist. I'm like bringing back so many of these.
That's the best compliment someone can give me. That is my goal here.
You're going to get it all out of me today. You're 100% right. That was one of those key learnings from that stage of my career. So this learning was in a very short period of time. So I did a year or two where I learned about my passion and the technical. Then I went to another, which was largely about the technical. And I went then back to the bedroom. So, I'm just going to keep working on myself, keep it small. Eventually I ended up, going into weddings of all things, wedding photography and filmmaking. And that came because I had a year where I really struggled. I just got married. I got married really young. And my wife at the time was a nurse, and the business just dried up all of a sudden. And that some of it was to do with the economy at that particular time. I was stuck. I felt a bit ashamed of myself. I just got married. She had married this entrepreneurial person, and all of a sudden there was no income. And I remember thinking, I am going to use these creative skills and I'm going to try something different, but I'm going to be highly creative in an area that doesn't normally get the level of creativity I wanted. But I was also attracted by the fact that if I was to book a wedding, I would be able to see that I had money coming up in July, even though we were sitting in February or May, for example. And so I could see a bit of the future with income coming, but I could hopefully find a way of being highly creative as a result so that those budgets would get bigger. But I wanted to do it really just for a temporary period of time, not as my end game.
How did you feel about the sales process of that? I know a lot of people who are creative typically shy away from the whole concept of sales. Yet if you're in a wedding photography business, you've got to hustle, right? You've got to find customers, you've got to get referrals. So was that difficult for you, or were you quite comfortable?
I loved it. The reason I loved it was that there's a part of me that still exists today. This is therapy. I know that I want to see people's reaction to something that's being created. So having a couple enter into my studio and then being able to see their reaction as they look through a portfolio, and then I would be able to storytell off that work. I loved that because I could see their appreciation. And that's actually the point where the storytelling element really clicked for me, which became my third pillar, in a way became my main pillar. Because at the very beginning, my shoots were like most other wedding photographers or videographers. And sure, I had a shallow depth of field and it was technically great, but it was lacking story. But when people were coming in to see me, I was trying to tell stories based on what had happened at the wedding. Then I thought, what would happen if I actually deliberately entered the wedding environment with storytelling in mind? And that changed everything.
How did you do that? What did that look like?
At first, what I did is I went in the day searching for a story, a thread. Now, the challenge with a wedding is you kind of know what the outcome's going to be. But there are these threads, these other storylines that happen along the way. It might be, it's raining, and rain was the last thing they wanted. But actually, if you start to follow that thread, it becomes quite exciting. What's going to happen? How's the bride going to feel? What's the reaction going to be? And you start to get all these brilliant shots because you're focusing on telling the story, but linked with the rain, whether it be using a reflection in the puddle, getting shots of people and their expressions as they're running in, trying to keep themselves dry. So that was a basic level of storytelling. However, I realized the power came when I started to interview my customers or clients in advance. And I would sit them down and I'd get them to talk about themselves, and I would start to, a bit like we're doing now, right? Chat, find out their origin stories. From that, I found out their own story and their narrative. And I would also find these other little threads and these anchors that my team, because it grew to a team once this started to take off, would be looking for throughout the wedding day. And because that happened in terms of that growth, but also people noticing that we were telling stories, we started to form an audience. And at that stage, we were going viral every week because people were waiting for the story.
Well, and it's so important now. We live in a world where storytelling has become almost a survival skill, a critical skill for our career. And you started understanding this and mastering it at an early time. I want you to pause and share something with us for a moment about that. How do you find the story? Because I think a lot of people are like, I'm just going to put up a picture of something, but that's not necessarily telling a story. How do you take something that seems mundane or everyday and drill down so that you find the story in the midst of that. No matter what your career is, your foundation of success begins with one thing: effective time management. And thanks to the generosity of Microsoft, you can get my entire course, Time Management Fundamentals, for free on LinkedIn Learning. Go to davegift.com to get your free access now. This is the course that millions around the world have used to become more productive and reduce stress. Everyone from Fortune 500 executives to freelancers to students. Now, it's the same coaching I've provided in person for tens of thousands of dollars per day, but you can get it for free on LinkedIn Learning. You don't need to provide anything to access it. No credit card, no email. Just go to davegift.com and start learning. Thank you so much, Microsoft and LinkedIn Learning, for your partnership. davegift.com.
I think if you are the teller, which is a role telling the story, the first thing is often it's the listening. Now, sometimes that listening is via research. In an ideal world for me, because I tend to work with people or organizations, it's directly asking those open questions. I think that's the key thing, is it starts off with that listening. And I think if you start to notice what storytelling structure is, it then means that it's easier to find that story. So, for example, you will know that we will have often an inciting incident, something that happens that means that someone decides to do an action or go somewhere that they would not have done had this thing not happened and incited that action. Then you then go on this journey, which is full of obstacles, in the hope that you get to the end goal. Once you understand that that's the simple version of a story structure, as you have conversations with people, you'll start to identify it, even if they don't know it themselves. And then you're able to leverage that to have the impact or drive the purpose that you need to.
I love that. Looking for the inciting incident and then how that drives the story to come to life. When did you make the transition away from being a wedding photographer, videographer, to more towards what you do now?
A client of mine, well, wasn't a client until later, but they invited me into, it was actually Barclays Bank, huge bank. It's on the 33rd floor, which is where they hold a lot of their conferences. They invited me in and I was a bit intimidated. I'm like, I bank with Barclays. I have no idea why they're meeting me. It definitely shouldn't be about my bank balance. It's not in the black a lot and it's not too far in the red. It made no sense to me, but I was definitely happy to be there. And I sat around this board table and one of the directors said to the others in the room, "Have you seen the wedding video that's in Venice?" I was confused and someone said, "Yes." "Did you watch the video, Josephine, that happened in India where they told the story of the dress?" "Yes." "Did you watch the story about such and such?" It became apparent that these individuals had actually watched a lot of the Vivida's content that was wedding content, and they were reciting the stories.
Wow.
And turned round to me and said, "You see what you did there? We watch wedding videos that none of us are getting married, but we're aware of your content. Could you apply the same approach to do some storytelling on this corporate strategy?" And I said, yes. Then they told me they gave me the buzzwords and I said, "What is that?" So the answer is yes, I will find a way. And then the unique approach ended up being is that Vivida ended up being this place that you would come with a concept that I wouldn't understand. In reality, maybe the whole organization wouldn't necessarily understand, but we would use storytelling to make it digestible, understandable, and engaging. And that was the moment that it clicked. And over time, we then transitioned from doing the wedding storytelling into telling stories that were seen by larger audiences and importantly had greater value for that organization. So of course, the project sizes were drastically different. And then that correlation between value that you mentioned earlier, creativity, started to click to a different level, and we started to act on that.
And it's the work that you did in weddings and how you developed that skill and became an expert at storytelling that opened that door, right? Because you were honing your craft, you were getting better at it, and then thankfully someone had the insight to say, this can apply somewhere else. But that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't become a master of storytelling in the wedding industry first.
To add another point that I think about, which I think is really key, whenever you're working, deliver it to the best of your ability. I could have said, I was working in graphic design, I had helped build a startup, and now I'm doing wedding work. This is beneath me, and I'm going to just do it to a simple standard, match the rest of the market. But what I decided to do was I had my own core values of what I expected of myself. I forgot about what everyone else was doing and delivered it in my own way to the highest standards possible, which then ironically meant that when a large organization looked at it, whether it was a Barclays, it ended up being a Unilever, and Canon, actually, that's how I became an ambassador. They saw the work. Because the standard was of a commercial grade, that transition from one to another, they made the link in their head.
Yeah, that's fantastic. There's a turning point that occurred here, which is now you're starting to do commercial work. How did you let go of weddings? Because that had been lucrative for you. It had been working. How did you finally make a full transition away from that?
It was tough because I wanted and needed the revenue, and I had a certain amount of staffing that was based on the levels of income that we had. And we had built up the size of the wedding so that they were actually more than some commercial jobs at the start. It was a client of mine. We went out to dinner and he said, look, at the moment, you're leaning so much on the crutch of the wedding work that you're not fully engaged in taking the risk you need to take on the commercial work. And so he encouraged me to take the leap of faith. And I ended up stopping totally the wedding work. And then I ended up being all in, and it was scary. It was tough. The income dropped drastically for a time, but I stuck with it. And eventually it then went up, and then, naturally far outweighed what we had been doing from a wedding side of things.
Yeah, that's a big risk to take, but you had the faith to do it and persevere through that.
I think that's where having the right voices around you as support is really important. One of the challenges I had personally is partly it's maybe cultural. Many people will resonate with not necessarily having a network around you that you feel that you can lean on for advice. So when this client, and for me, these clients were really important, they would then have these conversations that were unlike conversations I was used to having, talking about entrepreneurship, taking risks, working with organizations, etc. And so those relationships were highly valuable, which is why I think I focus on having or taking so much time and having those conversations with the younger versions of myself, because I realize how important they are to moving. Then it was me, but now it's them forward.
You said the right voices of support. Who were the right voices of support for you?
I think the voices I needed the most was from those that were in my ICP or my ideal client or customer profile, because they knew and had an understanding of where I was trying to get to. They had a really good understanding of what we were delivering at that particular time. I have great supportive wife and family around me, so that's been great. I find that those that are within your team or organization, they will often be very supportive of what you are doing now, because they might be their livelihood. might be the use of their talent, is based on what you're doing now. The moment you start to think ahead, for some that are in your circle, that actually denotes risk. So I've actually learned to not over-index on those who may be employees in a team if you're talking about future strategy. An example of this, Cornell now ends up being one of my best friends. He was an individual who saw me doing wedding work, and he knocked on my door and said, I would love to support you as an assistant. And he came and he volunteered for free, and he helped me on a number of shoots. He was so good, so talented that I employed him. Then he got involved in the wedding work, and it was transformative for me because he allowed me to grow the business. I was transformative for him because he grew skill under my mentorship into a stage where his skill set was just brilliant. But the moment I decided I wanted to stop doing weddings, he was in total disagreement. And our friendship fractured for a time and we separated. Why? Because he wanted to keep the business going as it was, because that's what served his interests. As a relationship with me being his boss, but then forming into a friendship, if I had over-indexed on that, I would not have moved the business forward. We parted ways. And there was a moment when our friendship was frosty because of that. But later on down the journey, now, whenever you see clients we're working with, it's Cornell that's now working with us side by side. And our friendship is now a true friendship. And I now keep that in mind whenever I'm looking to keep growing on that journey, to make sure that I'm listening to those right voices. And those right voices are not necessarily based on proximity, not necessarily based on those who are closest to you or those who are already in your circle.
Oh, that's so profound. There are two things I want to call out on that and draw attention to. First is, and everybody uses a different term, and I have a book called The Focus Business. I call it your most valuable customer. Listen to your most valuable customer. They are the people who are paying the most, they're buying the most, and their opinion is what matters most. And you always want to continually get their insight. So that part of it is fantastic. The other thing is understanding that entrepreneurs and employees are driven by two different things entirely. Entrepreneurs are driven by risk and reward. If I take this risk, I can see the payoff, and they're willing to take those risks and make those changes, just as you did, to transition away from wedding work. Employees are mostly driven by stability and security. And so they don't want to see a lot of change. They're not quite as interested in these big things because, hey, that could change their income. Neither is right nor wrong. In fact, I feel like the push and pull between those two things is essential for success. And your story illustrated that so beautifully. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, you're 100% right. I totally agree.
So you still have people on your team, people you still manage and lead?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Now through what we're doing, the team has grown. It shifts and changes because our key aim is to keep blending storytelling with technology and the creative process. And you can imagine that our tech has changed. We've worked with virtual reality and crafting and telling stories where we place people directly in the story, to then crafting interactive experiences that scale. Those things that we were doing back when I was in that boardroom with Barclays has now changed and transitioned a lot. So we're always innovating, and so the team grows, and sometimes that team has to change in order to facilitate the change that is going to happen next.
What have you learned from hiring and leading a group of people like that?
The thing I've learned is not to focus on hiring people that are exactly like you. The reason I say that is because I'm creative, and I feel that if I dug deeper, there would be traits or elements that would point to a condition and to ADHD. So my mind creates these sparks, right, in these ideas. And then what I'm able to do is I'm able to create the prototype. I can create systems and models. But what I don't do is I'm not the person that will maintain a system. So often when I find myself talking to people, I may form a very quick relationship with someone who I can bounce off the creative ideas, and the sparks are flying, and it's like, we are creatively making love, if you see what I mean. However, I now know what I need is the individuals within the team who will be the reins, or they will be the individuals that will be able to look at a system and a model that I've put together and be able to use that as a mold to go and create really consistently, and they're happy staying in that space. So I've learned to identify where my weaknesses are, or my differences, depending on how you want to look at it, and try to recruit for that.
Talk to me a little bit about your personal life. How do you make time for fun? How do you make time for family?
I struggle, truthfully, with making time for fun. The reason I hesitate is because I have a lot of fun doing what I'm doing. That's one of the lessons that I learned very early on. So if I find myself with spare time, I end up tinkering, and I end up playing, and I end up creating, and then that thing I'm creating ends up becoming a thing that we end up working with. So I feel like I have crafted a role for myself in the business whereby the things I find fun, I'm actually doing for work. I struggle sometimes to find what that thing is outside of work. And I think that's one of the things with creativity, right? Is it work, or is it just part of your natural desire to craft and to shape?
There's an interesting book that I don't know if you've come across it. It's by John Cleese, Creativity, A Short and Cheerful Guide. And it's exactly what it is. It says it is. It's a short and cheerful guide. But one of the things that he talks about is the value of how play promotes creativity. So doing something outside of work helps you solve problems or come up with creative ideas that maybe wouldn't have occurred if you were just forcing yourself to, I'm going to sit down and be creative. Is that something that you've found to be true for you?
Yes, it is. I think I work in two modes. There's one mode where I respond really well to constraints, and time and pressure ends up being one of those constraints. The challenge is that reward system can drive you totally in the wrong direction from a personal perspective. And to your point, I think I've recognized that and do allow time to give myself space to see what happens. And that's how I think of it. Rather than it being having fun, I think of it as providing and creating space, because that's where my true creativity often comes out.
I think we could talk about this for a long time. I'm fascinated about the creative process and how it's working for you and what you've been doing.
Yes, I think that, look, creative process is something that in some ways can be taught. The bit I've had to learn is to create that space, but also to allow myself to be in different places and different scenarios, because I'm in the studio right now. Ironically, this is no longer my creative space, because the moment I'm in one spot for a period of time, it doesn't spark off new ideas because everything around here is fixed. So I know that I need to be placed in different environments with different people. And yes, that can sometimes be a family or a different type of playful activity.
Interesting. I like that idea of placing yourself in different environments to stir creativity. I hadn't thought of that before, but that's really clever. Where do you see yourself in your business 5 years from now? What's the plan that you see ahead as the visionary?
The vision for me is to scale the impact of what we do and what I do by still keeping that unique blend of that creativity, that storytelling, and then also the technology. The aim for what we do now is to change the way people are educated in organizations, leaning into the younger version of myself. Actually, as you've reminded me, I'm actually going back to the original, in some ways, elements of the original business that I was involved in when I was 16. It was involved in, providing an educational resource for people that was different and it was unique. And that's what we've now really started to stumble on, is learning from all of these different ways in which people learn, the way people absorb stories and how beneficial it is. I can now see a really exciting way that we can really scale that to reach thousands and thousands of people.
That's exciting. I'm going to be looking forward to seeing that progression. Okay, so here's the point, Simeon, where unfortunately I have to start wrapping up. But what I do with every guest that I interview, and I know you've heard some of the interviews, is I like to summarize possible action steps that someone can take. The idea is that someone listening does something today or this week, not a month from now, not a year from now, but something they do immediately to make your success story a part of their success story. So I'm going to suggest 3 of them, and then I'd love for you to chime in at the end and add one potential action they could take. Sound good?
Sounds great.
Okay. The first is going back to the beginning of your story, how you blended technology with creativity. And I would invite someone listening to this to say, are there a couple of things that you're really interested in and passionate about that don't seem to connect with each other? And then ask yourself the question, is there a way that I could connect them together? And within that, you might find the genesis of an interesting career turn or something that you can do that makes you truly unique in the marketplace, like Simeon's done. The other one is that concept of delivering to the best of your ability. Simeon was doing that with the wedding videos and the stories that he was telling with that. And he was doing it, the term that he used was at a very commercial grade, meaning it's the highest possible grade. And him doing that with weddings, it opened up the opportunity to do it for brands and major companies. Had he not been doing it to the best of his ability, that opportunity wouldn't have been there. So I would invite you to say, what could I do to do a little bit more to increase the quality of the work that I'm doing so that it opens up the doors in the future? And then that one concept of listening to the right voices of support, how you were listening to people to help you understand what strategic choices you'd make in the future. And in particular, listen to your most valuable customer. Listen to that person who's going to buy what you want. And even if you're not an entrepreneur and you're listening to this, ask yourself, who is my customer? Is it my boss? Is it the boss that I want to have? Is it the company I want to work for? And try to get that opinion, and that will guide and influence some of your future career choices. All right, Simeon, those are my 3. What would you add to it?
I love those 3. What I would add is, what are you learning about yourself? As you listen to my story, you'll notice that I ended up learning a lot about myself, whether it be the things I was exceptionally interested in, the things I was gravitating towards. And then once I understood how I worked, I was able to lean into that. So revisit elements of your childhood, the jobs that you've had in the past, what you're doing now, and write down on a piece of paper, look for those patterns, those things that you notice about yourself, so that you can use that to your advantage to become an unfair advantage in future.
I love it. What a great principle. Thank you so much, Simeon, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to listen in all of your future episodes as well.
And what's the best place for people to go if they want to follow you, they want to keep track of your work and be inspired by you? Where would you like them to keep in touch with you?
LinkedIn is probably the best way. Simeon Quarrie on LinkedIn or on Instagram.
Okay. And in case you're just listening to this, Quarrie is Quarrie. Thank you very much, Simeon. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Remember, it's not just about the inspiration that you received from hearing Simeon's story. It's not just about the knowledge you gained, but it's about the action that you take. So please do one thing as a result of what you heard from Simeon today, and you'll make his success story a part of your success story.
You've been listening to the Dave Crenshaw Success Show, hosted by my dad, Dave Crenshaw, and produced by Invaluable Incorporated. Research and assistant production by Victoria Bedez. Sound editing by Nick Wright. Voiceover by me, Darcy Crenshaw. And the music is by Ryan Brady via Pond 5 licensing. Please subscribe to the Dave Crenshaw Success Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you like to get your podcasts. If you have a suggestion for someone my dad might like to interview, please send it to guests@davecrenshaw.com. And please don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. See you next time.